everybody. It's my pleasure today to introduce my good friend and fellow UNC Tar Heel, Jonathan Daw. You can call him JD. I think he feels comfortable with it. JD is currently an assistant professor of sociology and demography at Penn State University. Like I said, he got a PhD at UNC Chapel Hill. He does a lot of work in the areas of health, demography, inequality, and some stuff on social networks now. He's been published, I think he has nearly 24 peer-reviewed articles at this point. He's been published in places like AJS, the American Journal of Public Health, Social Science and Medicine, JHSP, all the places you'd be looking for if you were studying the things that he studied. He's got a new, relatively new NIH R1 grant that we're going to see some work presented from. And so without further ado, I will introduce you to JD Daw.
Thanks, everyone. Yes, you can call me JD, only my parents and my papers call me Jonathan. So thanks so much for having me out. This is actually my first time on UCLA campus since the 2005 PhD recruitment cycle, so it's good to be back. Sorry about going to UNC instead, that's personal. And then I think the following year we had a PA in LA, and I literally have not been here since 2006. So great to be back. I look forward to seeing what's happening in the place. Anyways, now that I'm here, I'd like to tell you about some work in progress that I'm collaborating on with my colleagues Ashton Verdery and Selena Ortiz. And this work I'm going to show you these results are so new that even they haven't seen some of it yet. Some of these models were run like last week and we just haven't read about it yet. So, which is all to say, this is hot off the press, which will be my excuse if I made any mistakes, but also if you have any comments, questions, challenges, denunciations, all of this are welcome at this stage because it's very much work in progress right now. And I understand you maybe have a tradition of doing that in the middle of the talk, and I'm completely comfortable with that. So let's roll. First, I want to acknowledge literally dozens of people that have worked on this project over a few years, from the pilot stages in 2015 till today, at 3 different institutions. Can't name them all, but they're all fantastic. And 3 rounds of funding we've received from 2 of my employers, UAB from the Comprehensive Transplant Institute, from the Penn State University Population Research Institute, and most recently from the National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Diseases. And yes, I have to check the exact wording every time. Anyway, thanks to all of them and to everyone who's been involved. Of course, anything you want to denounce is my fault. So I want to center your thoughts for a minute, now that I've thanked everyone I know, on one big question, which is, to whom do we turn in times of need? This is, I think, a really central question in a lot of sociology, and it's not really what I got into the field to study, but there's something about the subject that I'm going to talk about today that really leads you in this direction. So you might think that we turn to those who are most able to help, or as you remember, they're like strong, capable, ready to go. You might think we turn to those that we're closest to, those that we share long relationship histories with. Or you might think that we avoid those very people in part because we're so close. It's counterintuitive, but all 3 of those arguments have been made in recent work in the literature on social network tie activation. People have studied a variety, and by social network tie activation I mean you have a connection with somebody. Who do you turn to when you need something? How do you light up that tie in the sociograph? So people have reached these divergent conclusions, studying a variety of types of help-seeking and giving in a variety of types of networks. So these are very different conclusions. How do we resolve this? I think that one way that we can do that is by examining a wide variety of different types of help-seeking processes. If the conclusions we reach on these questions might be very different, depending on whether we're studying, say, financial assistance, emotional support, or living donor kidney transplants, which is, of course, what we're here to talk about today. Now, living donor kidney transplantation, or I'll sometimes on the slides refer to it as LDKT, so you know what that is a fairly extreme case of help-seeking and giving, but it has life and death consequences, so it's very serious, and probably some very unique determinants compared to some of those other forms of tie activation I just discussed. So I hope that examining this extreme case will shed light on the kind of scope conditions under which different patterns of help seeking and giving emerge. But of course, so it has theoretical implications, but it's not just about theory. This is a picture I took at one of the recent meetings of the American Transplant Congress. It's a traveling quilt dedicated to deceased kidney donors, I believe, which really starts to remind us that tackling this problem has real-world consequences for the lives of hundreds of thousands of patients in the US today, and the many more who love them, who wrestle with these decisions, whether it's the decision to donate their own kidney to a loved one, or to donate their loved one's organs to someone else after they pass away. So, one complication in that very difficult decision on either side is that patients with end-stage renal disease, or ESRD, I'll use that abbreviation too, that's kidney failure, colloquially, they have options. First, they can go on dialysis. This can keep you alive indefinitely with higher mortality rates than those without kidney disease, but is a form of kidney replacement, just like kidney transplantation. But it statistically has worse outcomes than those who receive a deceased donor transplant. This is if you, I don't know how you do it in California, if you signed up as an organ donor, you might have a little heart on your license or something like that. If you die in a suitable way, at a suitable age and suitable health situation, then they might take your organs and distribute them to those in need. That's better than dialysis if you are on the receiving end of a deceased donor transplant, but that itself is worse than a living donor transplant statistically. A living donor transplant is associated with an additional 6 to 8 years of what they call graft function, of persistent function of the kidney. Is of the currently available options the optimal therapy for patients with end-stage renal disease, and offers risks that are considered to be acceptable to the donor. There's data coming out about the long-term consequences of it that we didn't have in large numbers in previous years. But all in all, the risks to donation seem to be minimal, and the benefits seem to be high. So despite these very favorable cost-benefit considerations, and I think progressively greater awareness of those cost-benefit calculations, the living donor transplant system is in crisis. You can see that in recent years, the total number of kidney transplants has increased. And the number of deceased donor kidney transplants has increased, whereas the number of living donor transplants has stayed flat or actually slightly declined. So living donor transplant rates and counts are down since 2004 in a pretty persistent pattern. Meanwhile, waiting times for deceased donor transplants are up, and so are racial and ethnic and socioeconomic disparities in the receipt of living donor kidney transplants. Today, more than 100,000 people are seeking a kidney transplant in the United States alone, and the waiting list is just the tip of the iceberg. So there's 100,000 people on that waiting list. All in all, there's about 650,000 people with kidney failure in the United States. And on top of those two numbers, there's about 200,000 people in the United States who have a currently functioning, who live with a currently functioning kidney transplant, but also live with the knowledge that that's not going to function forever, and they might have to go back through the process again. So, to help resolve what I hope I persuaded you is a very difficult situation, I argue that effectively, ethically, and equitably promoting living donor kidney transplants offers the most promising solution out of this bind. I think that it is medically, ethically, and demographically feasible for living donor kidney transplant rates to increase from the current 15% of all kidney transplant candidates, and that's those on the waiting list, that ignores people off the waiting list, to half or more. I think this is entirely feasible. So to more than triple the current rate of living donor transplants. I also believe that the social determinants of the living donor search process are the best way to understand and effectively intervene in the process, in this process to promote higher and more equitable rates of living donor transplants. Finally, I think that applying the lessons of the theoretical debate on help seeking and giving will really be a critical step to understanding how to both promote living donor transplants and intervene in any obstacles to doing so. So, now that you're hopefully hooked, here's the outline of the rest of the talk. I'm going to briefly, actually kind of already have the rest, I'm going to talk to you about the living donor kidney transplant relationship distribution. I think this is a really key thing to understand the social process undergirding this outcome. And then I'll go into some theory about help seeking and giving behaviors, and then we'll get into the data. Okay. So here we go. This is the distribution of living donor relationships to the recipient. I'm not sure how well you can read these labels. I'm going to use these abbreviations throughout the study, so just because we have scatter plots later, it would be difficult to spell it out. This top category is siblings, constituting almost 25% of all living donor transplants. Next, we have friends or non-relative acquaintances coming in just under 20. Children at 18, so be nice to your kids. Spouses at 16, be nice to your spouse. Anyway. And then you have a big drop off to the rest of these categories, right? So we have other family here, that's OF. Parents are the only nuclear family type that's not in that top tier. We'll discuss reasons why that might be. And then you get into the more kind of second order relatives down here at the bottom, cousins, nieces and nephews, aunts and uncles, grandchildren, and grandparents. So if given the title, Renal Relationships, Understanding Living Donor Kidney Transplants, you might think, okay, well now we know the answer, let's just stop. But I think there's a lot to unpack here, obviously, because I'm giving an hour-long talk about it. So I think there's a few things you've got to keep in mind that may be obvious to the CCPR audience, but I don't want to name check it anyway. First, typical kinship networks have very different counts of these different kinds of ties. Numerically, you can have many more siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, and nieces and nephews than you can at least biological parents and grandparents. And typically, we follow a one spouse at a time rule in American culture, so you're going to be numerically limited on that as well. Furthermore, these relationships have different kind of age gaps between them due to the typical generational structure. Obviously, that's mandatory for parents to be older than children by definition. In practice, that's going to be true for aunts and uncles as well, and in reverse, nieces and nephews will be younger, and so on. So there's this generational structure that's going to be correlated with the probability of being healthy enough to donate. The health conditions that would disqualify you as a living donor are severely age-rated. Which last time I presented that really depressed some of the older researchers in the room. So next, these relationships are also going to differ in their genetic relationship to the patient, which could influence their odds of having a compatible blood type and tissue types. So that would be a consideration as well. And on the social cultural side, as I'll unpack in a minute, these different kinds of relationships have very different kinds of sets of norms of obligations to one another. You treat your siblings and your children and your parents and your spouse very differently than you do your aunts and uncles and cousins who you maybe see once a year on Thanksgiving and can't remember where they work. And have the same conversation kind of anyway, you know. At least maybe y'all are better about that than me. So anyway, there's a lot to unpack here. So finally, this is for data I calculated myself from 2008 to 2017, which included about 1,500 lines of recodes because a lot of these were open-ended text entries. This is data from the, yes?
So is the age structure and just the availability of a good organ the reason that parental level is relatively low?
I strongly suspect yes. Ask me again in 2 years. Because the problem is, I'm going to show you some data that peers into the hidden population of potential donors who maybe never, for whatever reason, never set foot in a hospital to be evaluated as a donor. Without more systematic data on that hidden population, I can't answer that question definitively, but it seems extremely likely, yes. But yes, we'll get into that some more. But I actually want to do a whole study based around that, so I'll be sure, if I don't answer that on the final slide, remind me. So here's the trends over that same time period, and you can see they're categorized differently. This is from a data report from the Scientific Registry of Transplant Research, or I think I got SRTR right. Anyway, by related here, they mean genetically related for this, what is that, a violet line, blue? Anyway, you can see that there's the rate at which genetically related donors, the number of genetically related donors has declined by about half just since 2006, right? And you can see that other categories maybe are ticking slightly up, prominently what they call unrelated directed, which is friends and acquaintances. Directed means that I'm giving it to this person, not to just whoever. Which also happens, but is beyond the scope of this research. Finally, there's also paired donation, which has tripled, I think, since the mid-2000s. Unfortunately, my data can't really speak to it, so I'm going to leave it to the side. But that's where, let's say, I wanted to donate to my brother, and Michael wanted to donate to his, but I was incompatible with mine, and Michael was incompatible with his, but I was compatible with his, and vice versa. Then we could just swap, right? It's a way around blood and tissue type incompatibilities. And its prevalence in the distribution has skyrocketed. Unfortunately, the way the administrative data is collected means I can't code who the person who tried to donate to a person was. So they would code that as a paired donation and not say what the relationship was on the other side. Anyway, But you can see that pair donation and friends and acquaintances are up, and genetically related relatives are down. And spouse partners, I think, is pretty constant. That's the thing to find there. Okay, so how should we make sense of all this? I think one key is thinking hard about, yes?
I have a question about pair donation.
Yes.
So do the pairs have to be people that know each other?
Not at all.
It's just strangers that are maybe in the same hospital?
Yeah, in fact, I think that's the norm.
Okay.
So I think this is going to vary a good deal from hospital to hospital. This isn't as institutionalized as, say, the deceased donor outpatient system, where they have a very precise algorithm of offer orders. Here, there are algorithms involved here. The economists in the room may know that, somebody, I forget the name of the economist, won the Nobel Prize for designing systems for how to optimize kidney donation chains and paired exchange pairs and this kind of thing. So they do have a system, but I think the exact implementation may vary from hospital to hospital. So that's a subject I very much want to delve into the future. I just haven't been able to get my hands on any data yet, at least any representative. But that's beyond the scope of what I'm doing today. Instead, I'm going to talk to you about a book written 45 years ago in the early days of organ transplantation. The first successful kidney transplant was conducted in 1954. Renee Fox and Judith Swayze published The Courage to Fail in 1974, just 20 years after that, when it was still very much being done on a very small scale. And I think they gave us a lot of the setup about the social embeddedness of organ transplantation and the cultural significance thereof. That will give us some of our answers here. They wrote, organ transplantation takes place under circumstances that impose constraints on the persons involved. The freedom to give or to receive an organ is neither absolute nor random. These freedoms are mediated and governed by the norms of gift exchange on the one hand, and by an at once biological, psychological, and sociological screening process that we've referred to as gatekeeping on the other. So that sets up a couple things we'll want to pay heed to, but I will explain how it works in 2019 as opposed to 1974. First, the gatekeeping role, probably the role of kind of sociological screening has declined to be kind of, if you go back and read their book, which I highly recommend to anyone, there's a lot of stories of doctors saying, well, yes, this person's compatible, but she's a young woman, she'll probably want to be a wife and mother soon, we shouldn't take her organ. Let's, a lot of sexism like that went into these kinds of decision making. So these very kind of, so there was a lot of kind of social engineering that went into living donor transplants that I don't think you'll see today. But there is still a great deal of medical gatekeeping, following three principles. They want to avoid harms to the donor, harms to the recipient, and they want to ensure that everyone involved is able to fully consent. So harms to the donor would include, there's a long list of what they call absolute and relative contraindications for donation. I can show you the list in the backup slides if you want. But this will include a series of conditions that would make donating a kidney harmful to the donor. Things like hypertension, diabetes, having kidney disease yourself, and so on, recent cancer, this kind of thing. Harm to the recipient would include blood type incompatibility, pre-sensitization to mismatched tissue types, or perhaps the donor has an infectious disease you don't want to transmit to the recipient, things like HIV, AIDS, hepatitis, and so on. Finally, the ethical principles involved are designed to ensure that everyone involved is able to fully consent. So you need the donor needs to be a non-incarcerated adult. With respect to racial and socioeconomic disparities, I'd love to dig into that issue more in the future. They need to be free from coercion to donate and free from evidence of any illicit financial exchange. And they need to be sufficiently free from mental illness to ensure that they're able to fully consent to the process. As far as the living donor search process, the other component of living donation that Fox and Swayze highlighted, we don't actually know a lot about it because, as I was mentioning in response to Janie's question, there's a hidden pool of potential donors that never enter into any of these studies, right? So if I need a kidney transplant, I have 3 brothers, 1 living parent, something like 10 cousins, about the same number of aunts and uncles. Not all of them are going into the clinic to be tested as living donors for me, right? There's going to be a select population, and we don't know how select that is because we don't know anything about the networks outside of the people that come into the hospital, right? So we don't really know what the search process looks like. We have little hints. We ask people to kind of say, how many people did you talk to? How did this go? But it tends to be very much selection on the dependent variable type of studies. So the eventual goal of this broader project that I don't have time to tell you about is to really fully map out those networks and that search process to really understand the social determinants of living donation in the future. But as I mentioned, and also we're going to test some interventions on it. That's outside the scope of today's talk. But very briefly, one might theorize that this network search process reflects a few influences, such as the size and structure of the candidate network. All else equal, that would be more people that potentially donate. And of course, it's driven by demographic events as well as kind of social network formation processes. There's the donation relevant characteristics of the people in your network, especially their health and genetic relationship to you. There's your relationship quality and history, what kind of relationship you have with that person. And then there's the broader kind of cultural construction we have of different kinds of relationships in the United States that I referred to it before. Once that search process is underway, there's a regimented series of steps you might want to know about. I'll just skip ahead to tell you that I'm only going to consider 2 today. I'm going to really focus on the living donor discussion. I think this is a critical and understudied process that's happening outside of clinic walls that fundamentally influences what happens within it. And then I'm going to compare that to eventual living donor transplants. I have data on the intervening steps, but like I said, it's just work in progress. We haven't done to that, and we have some small end issues there and some more data. Okay, so let's. I'm going to try to quickly kind of circle back through the theory literature that I already referred to. A couple things I want to highlight. First, if you've ever read any sociological, anthropological, or other social science work on blood, tissue, or organ exchange, everyone talks about Marcel Mauss, so I have to too, or else, I don't know, I'm probably lose my PhD. So in 1954, Marcel Mauss wrote The Gift, which is a kind of statement of universal principles of gift exchange that many have applied to the issues of living donor transplantation. He wrote that all gift exchange universally entails the expectation that participants will symmetrically and reciprocally engage in 3 roles over time in the course of a pair-level relationship. That of the giver, the receiver, and the repayer. In other words, if you are the recipient of a particular gift, it is incumbent upon you to repay it in the future at an equivalent level. And that failure to do so creates a social debt and potentially a social strain on the relationship. So that's all I'll say about Marcel. Then I also want to talk about American kinship obligations very briefly. I think there, especially with reference to Marcel's arguments here. I don't know why Marcel and I are on a first-name basis, but let's go with it. Yeah, I think there's 2 big exceptions that are embedded in the American kinship system. One is that parent-child ties are a major exception to the expectation of symmetrical and reciprocal exchange, at least in any short-run period of time. So maybe over the long run, my parents take care of me when I'm young. I take care of them when I'm old, when they're old. But in the short term, Michael doesn't expect Arlo or Cash to appreciate or even know all the things that he does for them, much less reciprocate them, right? Well, okay, let's face it, Carrie. But that's his one. Okay, yeah. So parent-child ties are a major exception to Marcel Mauss's rules of gift exchange. The other maybe partial exception, depends on your relationship, would be spousal pairs. Of course, there's give and take expected in spousal pairs more so than in parent-child pairs. But in times of crisis, we do have a cultural expectation that spousal pairs or partnerships will go above and beyond the usual call of duty to fulfill the sort of till death do us part ethos of American marriage and partnership, and generally. So this should help us understand the context of the major debates. And then I really wish Judy Seltzer was here, but I also feel better about this section because I'm going to give it really the short shrift on all of this stuff. I want to basically highlight 3 different theories that you might have about how this works. Yes?
Sorry, I had a question about the parent-child. Would it behave differently child-parent, right?
Yeah, I think it might almost be an affront to the parent if a child tried to reciprocate everything beyond below a certain age, right? Any of you, when you moved off and went to college, any of you have fights with your parents, or like when you went home and insisted on doing your own laundry and cooking your own meals and trying to be a good sociological feminist or whatever in a context where maybe it's just me. This was the subject of a lot of the fights I had with my mom between the ages of 18 and 24. I would say, she wanted to still fulfill that parent role, that unidirectional parenthood role, and I was trying to break free of that, And so I think that, yeah, there's like a lot of constraints on what a child can do in certain ways, but you did see that on the graph, that the child ties were, I think 18% of all transplants, so clearly it's not that limiting. I think that might have something to do with the age at which they typically donate. Like most people will get kidney disease, get it in their 50s and 60s, so maybe their children are grown up enough to where this is less of an affront if the children are in their 30s and 40s.
I just know parents hesitate to ask their children for a donation because they don't want to put them in harm's way.
Totally. I have some qualitative evidence in support of that hypothesis. Numerically, not so far. So I think that might be more of a they're resistant but persuadable kind of dynamic is how I'm kind of threading that needle. Again, that's something I really want to unpack in the future. Thanks for those questions. Okay, so let me check the time. Okay, behind schedule. So theoretical expectations, I'm going to sort them into 3 categories. The general literature on social network tie activation highlights ability to help and perceived need as one kind of key determinant. So those with relatively more income, who are relatively more geographically proximate, more conveniently able to be of assistance, those with more time or a deeper connection with people tend to be those who are most available to render help of the appropriate sort for those variables. Close tie activation is probably the conventional wisdom on this. So these are going to be oppositional hypotheses. This one's more kind of one that you have to consider for a living donation, as well as financial donation or anything else. Close tie activation is the idea that, you know, the like GSS important matters question. You know, from time to time we all turn to people when we want to discuss important matters. Who are the people that you turn to in those contexts? This kind of name generator question. This has been a subject of a large and lengthy literature in social network research and on tie activation research. And we generally find that people have a kind of close group of confidants, 2 to 3 to 4, something like that. There's socioeconomic and racial gradients, but mostly on the friend side, not on the family side. But you generally find that family is a disproportionate share of this network. If you ask people, if you only had to do with one, friends or family, which could you rely on exclusively? They say family, not friends. So I think that's some context there. But a recent book by Mario Louis Small, someone to talk to, which I recommend to anyone who's interested in this subject, challenges this conventional wisdom with respect to confidence networks. He argues that this conclusion in the conventional wisdom is driven by a methodological decision. It's a methodological artifact. He thinks that if you ask people, what do you usually do, or else ask them to name people in their lives and then ask about who you kind of confided in, that's going to drive you towards the closest ties. That leads you to this kind of core discussion network conclusion. He argues that instead you ask them, what did you do last time you needed help or needed to get something off your chest? Who did you turn to? You find a lot of really weak ties if you do that, rather than what do you usually do. So this suggests that although close ties may be the most used ties that we have in terms of confidence networks, it may not be the majority of people that we confide in. That a lot of times if you're, for the grad students, or if your advisor has been really hard on you and you don't understand why, you probably just turn to whoever's in the lab, right? And say, can you believe Dr. Gaddis, what he said to me today, right? I've certainly said that many times. I don't call him Dr. Gaddis in those moments. Or you're having relationship problems and you're at the airport and some dude sitting next to you at the bar while you're waiting for your connection. Not that I do this, but it's this kind of scenario that constitutes a big share of all kind of confidence events, whether or not they're your most turned to relationship. Does that make sense? And Mario Louis Small further argues that this isn't just a matter of convenience, that for many types of support, we actively avoid our closest ties, which is kind of dark. But he argues it's because you have these established relationship patterns, and you know how a conversation is going to go, and it may not match what you need, with your spouse, with your sibling, with whoever. If you've had this kind of conversation before, it didn't go well, you might rather talk to a stranger about it than a traditionally closer tie. And interestingly, Fox and Swayze, who I quoted before, this is a different book, have a similar concept with regard to living donor kidney transplants, which they call the tyranny of the gift. They write, what recipients believe they owe to donors and the sense of obligation they feel about repaying their donor for what has been given weigh heavily on them. This psychological and moral burden is especially onerous because the gift the recipient has received from the donor is so extraordinary that it is inherently unreciprocal. Think back to Mauss's argument about what that would do for the relationship. So it has no physical or symbolic equivalent. As a consequence, the giver, the receiver, and their families may find themselves locked in a creditor-debtor vice that binds them to one another in a mutually fettering way. I hope to ever write as well as they do. So this small argument finds really strong parallels in the literature, sociological literature on living donor transplants. So they argue that, they go on to argue that in many cases, transplant candidates may be loath to imperil their relationships with their close ties by creating the sort of social debt that the tyranny of the gift dynamic can create. So this is probably the longest theory section of any talk I've ever given. So we're at 30 minutes, okay. So briefly,
You know that we go to 1:30.
I do. But I want to leave as much time for discussion because there's so much stuff that I'm leaving off the slides here, I promise.
Okay.
But thank you for that reminder. All right, I'll calm down, take a sip of water. How was y'all's weekends? Good? Okay. So I'm going to translate those three hypotheses we had, the ability to help, the close-tie activation and close-tie avoidance hypotheses to these. Sometimes they have the same name, tacking on tyranny of the gift to this one, but it's a parallel for living donation. So I'm going to test each of these at the kind of pair level and at the aggregate level as two different ways of seeing how well they fit the data. So at the pair level, the medical rationality hypothesis, which there could be other reasons you might have better ability to help, but I'm going to focus on the medical determinants for now. This hypothesis predicts that at the pair level, all else equal, candidates and alters will be more likely to initiate living donor discussions when they respectively perceive the alter to be healthy and a close genetic relative. Right? This would kind of, all else equal, increase the odds that if they were willing to donate, they could do so medically. Okay? At the aggregate level, excuse me, so I'm going to compare a lot of these results to what I think the kind of, what is demographically and medically feasible using one of the data sets I have with complete ego network of transplant candidates. So I'm going to say, if you take everyone in their lives that they think are healthy enough to donate, and calculate those different relationship categories share of that status, how does that compare to what the actual living donation rates are across those categories? And can you calculate a ratio of those two? So we say, what is the percentage of actual living donations that happen in that category? And what is the percentage of relationships in the category of people that the transplant candidate, the patient, thinks could donate if asked and were willing to? Right? So obviously that's an imprecise comparison. I'm going to explain to you. I'm working to extend that in a while. But for now, this is the most direct data we have about what the composition of the pool of medically suitable donors is in actual networks of actual transplant candidates. It's the only data set like that. So after this, I'm going to have to go to simulation, and eventually we're going to collect a much larger data set of those tests. So stay tuned. So we're going to compare with the actual distribution to the medically feasible one. And so if you have really big deviations from that at the aggregate level, from what the pool of medically suitable donors would imply, that suggests, that's not really what's driving what's going on here. If you have those big deviations from what that kind of null hypothesis world would predict. Okay, so after that, we'll go to the close-tie activation hypotheses and the close-tie avoidance. As those two highlighted words suggest, these are kind of opposite predictions. Right? So the activation hypothesis would suggest that those that appear to have closer ties will be more likely to have living donor discussions. And I'm also going to use geographic proximity as a proxy there. You can take or leave that as you wish. So we'll expect positive relationships there at the pair level with living donation and at the aggregate level with relative utilization compared to what I think is feasible. And then the opposite prediction for close-tie avoidance. There we go. Okay, so minute 30, it took 35 minutes to get to the data. Don't you hate that? Okay. I really feel like I get really excited about theory from studying this because I feel like I learned so much about non-transplant subjects from studying living donor transplantation. So I really wanted to take a minute to set that up. But that's I got a bunch of graphs for you. We're going to get through them pretty fast. So I think we'll be done in an hour. Two data sets. One I referred to a minute ago. The backronym is ENACT. That stands for Ego Networks Among Candidates for Transplant. I just like it when they spell things. This is a sample of 73 transplant candidates at a large southeastern kidney transplant center who report on their ego networks totaling 1,611 network alters, family, friends, confidants, spouses, and so on. So I really want to emphasize that this is the candidate perspective on these dynamics. That's who's reporting on the characteristics of their potential donors. But luckily we have the flip side, which is, here the backronym is, I pronounce it FORCE, the P is silent, just go with it. It's Families of Renal Patients Study. This is an online survey of people who indicated that they had close relatives who had, quote, weak or failing kidneys, which is the description that NIH uses to measure chronic kidney disease outside of the laboratory. So this is a sample of 970 respondents. We have another panel of 600 with a similar design, but we're still processing and weighting those data. So this is the other side. This is people who do not have kidney disease themselves, but a relative who does, who has relatively advanced kidney disease. So the argument is this is the best proxy that probably exists at the perspective of the potential donor pool, irrespective of living donor related behaviors. It's not perfect, but it's what we got right now. Yes?
How do they recruit the people for that?
For force?
Yeah.
I want to make everyone say it. We collected these data. This is this is part of the Qualtrics online survey panel, where it's one of these online panel studies where you can recruit into a bunch of studies. And so we just had a screening question. We described the kinds of relationships we wanted them to consider out to like grandparents and cousins and nieces and nephews, and said, does anyone like that in your family have weaker failing kidneys? Right? And then if they had more than one, then we said, all right, pick one and think of them consistently throughout and tell us which one this is. Any other questions about that? Okay, so again, the ENACT is the candidate perspective on their ego networks. FORCE is the perspective of potential donors, pretty realistic potential donors on that decision. Okay, so living donor discussions, as I told you before, is a key measure we want to capture here. So we do it in subtly different ways in these two data sets, mostly because our thinking evolved over the 3 years or so that happened between these two waves of data collection. So living donor discussions, in ENACT, we asked them, have you asked them or have they volunteered to be medically evaluated for donating a kidney to you? And they can say yes, they volunteered, yes, they asked, or no, no discussion. And if they have had a discussion, what did the other person say? So we assume that this has to be a mutually agreed upon type of thing. I'm going to focus on the first part today. We also did a proxy for the genetic relationship. It's not perfect. Within each relationship category, you have kind of the default genetic relationship, and then we ask, is this a blood relative or another kind of relative for the family ties? So that won't help us differentiate between, say, full and half siblings, but it will at least help us differentiate between biological siblings and step siblings, or aunts by marriage versus aunts by blood, this kind of thing. So it's not perfect, but when you're asking questions about 25 different people, 10 questions each, you got to kind of keep it to the minimum. We also asked, after transplant candidates, they got through an education session that the hospital was holding anyway, about living donation, including all the health conditions that would disqualify you as a donor. We gave them a survey and asked them, for each person, do you think this person is healthy enough to donate a kidney to you? It's, again, not perfect, but that's probably how people actually operationalize these decisions for living donor discussions. So that's what we're going to go on. For talk frequency, it's very coarse. Our top code is once a week or more, which literally everyone I've ever told about this data complained about, so we changed it for the next one to include a most or everyday one, but not in these days. For force, for living donor discussions, we measured it slightly differently. So we had a check all that apply. Is this person seeking a transplant? Have you discussed it? Have you agreed to be evaluated, and so on? Again, I'm just going to study the discussions for today's results. And then we differentiate between who initiated the conversation. I'm leaving out the someone else for now. I'm not quite sure what to do with that, and there weren't that many. I'll circle back to that later. Yes?
Does this data set include individuals who are interested in donating a kidney to a child?
No, we asked about adult relatives. I think this is going to be, I think the child.
Or an adult can donate to a child?
The child has to be relatively, it would have to be a relatively old child for a child. Yeah, like, 5-year-olds can't take adult kidneys, they're too big, that kind of thing.
Conservative,
Oh, yeah? Okay. Well, we restricted to adult recipients, so I didn't have to do that. Thank you for that context. Not that kind of doctor, folks, I apologize. Okay. So genetic relationships measured the same as in ENACT. Health, because people are reporting on their own health, we can ask a much more detailed health question here, which I think is much more satisfying. So here we have a list of absolute contraindications that automatically disqualify you as a living donor, and relative contraindications, which we say if you have 2 or more of these, we're going to say you're not healthy enough to donate. Again, I can show you that list if you want. We added the most or everyday talk frequency measured there. And then we also added a geographic proximity measure as an indicator of proxy for closeness, with a top code of 15 minutes of transit time or less, or co-residential, kind of collapse those two, and 6 hours or more travel time. Okay, so our analytical strategy, I think I pretty much told you, except for the logistic regression models of living donor discussions. I'm going to have 3 different models. 1, just the kind of focal variables. 2, 2, I'll add in candidate and alter demographic characteristics as well as their relationship. And 3, only for enact, I'm going to do candidate fixed effects. In other words, looking across all the relationships they have, which were you relatively more or less likely to have living donor discussions about. Okay, and then I'll test the medical rationality and close ties hypotheses separately, and then in a combined model. And I'll present the results as average marginal effects, or AMEs. Okay, let's get to some results, shall we? All right, let's start with the medical rationality hypothesis. So to remind you, this is the idea that, let's say we don't care about relationships, we're just trying to maximize the odds that someone is healthy enough and well-matched enough to donate to us. Who would we turn to, and how well does that fit the data? So these are coefficient plots of the AMEs for genetic relationship modeled continuously, and whether the candidate perceived them to be healthy and enact. And you can see, and this is for candidate-initiated discussions. I'm going to separately model those versus alter-initiated discussions. So for candidate-initiated discussions, as reported by the candidates, those that we calculate to have a relatively high genetic relationship coefficient with the recipient the candidates are more likely to initiate discussions with them. In the kind of model with just their health status and genetic relationship, that is statistically significant. In the case when we bring in the controls, it becomes much less precise. So the coefficient is still there, but the standard errors are wide. I think that's partially because we're controlling for the relationship category, which is going to be highly associated with the genetic relationship. I think it's debatable whether we should have a control in there or not. But in any case, that's the result. You can see that health doesn't really have much to do with it. The candidate's report on the alter's health does not appear to be very correlated with whether they initiated a living donor discussion with them, which I think is a pretty strong mark against the medical rationality hypothesis, since that's the primary determinant of ability to donate. In force, you see that there's no genetic relationship association, and actually those who reported that they didn't have any disqualifying health conditions were less likely to have been asked by their candidate to consider donation. Yes?
But back to your former point, if you thought that somebody had health conditions, you might not ask them.
Right, and I'm saying that the opposite pattern is here. People who are healthy were less likely to be asked.
Right, okay. Yeah.
Which is a little confounding.
Yeah.
I honestly don't know what to tell you about that.
Okay.
And in any case, it points against the medical rationality hypothesis. I want to dig into this in the future, maybe some qualitative data we have can shed some light on this. Or maybe it's one-off, it's hard to say at this point, at this juncture. All right, let's turn to altered initiated discussions with the same hypothesis. Here you see that, once again, without relationship controls, you have a small positive genetic relationship effect. So both candidates and alters, when they're initiating these conversations, it seems to be partially driven by your genetic relationship. But that goes away, at least in terms of statistical significance, once you bring in the relationship category. So this is probably a proxy for nuclear family effects overall. But here you see the opposite health pattern. For donor-initiated discussions or altered-initiated discussions, you see that people who report that they are free from disqualifying health conditions are more likely to initiate these discussions. So the candidates don't appear to be especially good at that, but alters' own reports on their health is associated with initiating these discussions. Oh wait, sorry, this is an act. This might be a kind of actually, I'm going to say a backwards kind of association where these conversations have already happened, and the candidate might be more likely to say that they're healthy because of that. I'm not sure how causally to interpret that, but it is relevant at least that the fixed effects model also shows that the candidate's perception of the alter's health is statistically significantly associated with donor-initiated discussions. In force, we don't find much of anything there. It depends on how seriously we take the standard errors there. But if anything, the genetic relationship coefficient is negative, and really nothing going on with health on the donor-initiated discussions. We can all say there's kind of mixed support here overall. There's some evidence of a genetic relationship effect, some evidence of a health effect, but it can go in both directions depending on who you ask. So in any case, it doesn't seem to be a super strong driver of what's going on here with living donor discussions, nor does it appear to especially strongly structure actual living donor transplant outcomes. I mentioned before I wanted to calculate the ratio at which different relationship categories are used relative to what I thought the plausible pool of donors is in an act. And here you can see that these ratios can be just huge. Grandparents, I'm not sure how much I trust grandparents advice, so let's leave grandparents and grandchildren aside. But you can see that aunts and uncles are used at about 1/7 the rate I calculate that they could be in the ENACT data, whereas spouses are used at almost 5 times the rate that they of their share of the medically plausible donor. So which is all just to say, this is all with reference to the medical rationality hypothesis, right? So these are just showing huge relationship category deviations from that calculation. So that calculation isn't perfect, but it would have to be just complete, not even nonsense, extremely biased nonsense to suggest that these relationship categories are primarily driven by the medical rationality hypothesis. Okay. And so then comparing that over and underutilization pattern, here 0 is the kind of no effect line. Because this is on a log 10 basis. I want basically a ratio of 2 to have the same vertical distance as a ratio of 0.5, since that's the same effect size. If you plot genetic relationship against relationship category over and underutilization, you certainly don't see a linear pattern. You could draw a concave up curve if you wanted. I don't know what kind of sense that would make, but it would at least fit the data. But in any case, there's no linear association of average genetic relationship in a category with over and underutilization patterns compared to what's medically and demographically feasible. Okay, so which is all to say, there might be effects in any individual cases going on here, but I really don't think it's what's driving the living donor relationship distribution. Yeah.
Sorry, I can please put this on the horizontal axis there?
Yeah, so that's these calculations expressed in a log 10 transformation.
So on the right would be spouses, right?
They'd be on the left. Well, they'd be on the top. This is the vertical.
Okay, and on that axis?
And on this axis is the calculated average genetic relationship in that category. Yeah, because what I'm categorizing as siblings will be a mixture of blood and non-blood siblings, so I just take the average. This is relationship aggregate average.
So what does a 3 mean, for example?
A 0.3? So, I mean, aunts and uncles and nieces and nephews that are biologically related to you are related to you with a genetic relationship coefficient of 0.25. Same as grandparents, grandchildren, half-siblings.
Okay.
Yeah, so siblings and parents are related at 0.5. Grandparents, grandchildren, and so on are 0.25. Cousins, 1.25. Okay, sorry, should have gone through that. So this is, if it's above 0, they're overutilized relative to what I think is medically and demographically feasible. If it's below 0, they're underutilized relative to that. And people further to the right are more on average genetically related, which is just to say that genetic relationships don't appear to be driving the actual living donation pattern. Does that make sense? Clear as mud? Okay, why don't we save it for the discussion and I can clarify if it's not clear in a minute. So I'm going to do the same sort of analysis here for the close tie activation and avoidance hypotheses. Here we're looking at the talk frequency. We're using the once a year or less as a reference category. And you can see compared to that, the people who communicate with those relatives once a week or more are more likely to initiate the candidates are more likely to initiate living donor discussions with them. And in the fixed effects model, you also see a significant effect of once a month or more, but less than once a week. So there does seem to be some kind of interactional frequency effects going on here, but including that of candidate level unobserved heterogeneity. You don't see a lot. So here we're doing the same test for the force data set. Here's the talking interaction category using once a month or less as the reference category, and here's the geographic distance categories using 6 hours or more transit time as the reference, and you basically don't get much of anything for candidate-initiated discussions here. It looks like noise to me. So that's that. Now let's turn to alter-initiated discussions. You see the same effect as you did for candidate-initiated discussions in ENACT. So from the candidate's perspective, those that they interact with most frequently are more likely to have both candidate and alter-initiated discussions. And like you would almost think it's the same graph. I promise you it's not. So it's a very similar set of results there. And I know because I double checked what way to this. So then if you turn to the alter perspective on the same question, what are the determinants of their own initiations of living donor discussions? You see that there is a most or everyday effect. It kind of edges into non-significance when you control for relationship category and so on, but it's still there. And you get a kind of weird effect where it's pumped up for the 16 to 45 minute geographic proximity, but not for the 15 minutes or less one. I'm not entirely sure what to make of And here's the graph that we were very confused by again, but this is going to be the proportion reporting the highest talk frequency category in the two data sets. And each of these are the relationship categories, and this is the relative utilization axis that I discussed before, where again 0 is no effect. So here are the overutilized relationship categories, and here are the underutilized relationship categories. And you can see that there's a pretty positive, consistently quasi-linear relationship between the two. In other words, relationships with which we typically interact with most frequency, with the highest frequency, are also the most overutilized relative to what is medically feasible at the aggregate level. Does that make sense? Okay. Except for grandchildren, those ungrateful little jerks. They keep standing out on these graphs, actually, it's fine. Okay, what if we look at the geographic proximity, which is only in force? Here I did cutoffs of 15 minutes or less, or 2 hours or less, and you see these parallel relationships. In other words, the closer you live to these different categories of kin, the more overutilized they are relative to what would be medically rational and demographically feasible. Okay, now if we combine, I feel like I'm hitting you over the head with the results. Suffice to say that a lot of this holds up in the combined model where we test them all at the same time. I won't walk you through all those, I think. Okay, so testing them simultaneously doesn't really change the takeaway. Is what I want to say there. So, okay. Now that I beat you over the head with 35 minutes of theory and about 20 graphs, I want to talk about implications, and then hopefully I can clarify whatever is not clear in the Q&A. So, making sense of the finding, I think we have moderate support for the medical rationality hypothesis. I went back and forth between moderate and weak here. It's on the weak side of moderate, I would say. In other words, there are these genetic relationship coefficients, but they're not consistent. There are these health effects, but it depends on who you ask and who initiated. It's not a really clear, strong story. In any case, we have these huge deviations from the actual living donor relationship distributions to what we would predict in the null hypothesis world, where everyone that was healthy enough to donate was equally likely to do so, which is what those graphs, the scatter plots I was showing you, are trying to measure. So I think we'd say mixed, moderate to weak support is where I'm going to land on that one. Close tie activation model, I think we have pretty strong support. There's some weird stuff for the geographic proximity, but that was more a direct measure. Generally, the people that you talk with most frequently are those that we over-rely on compared to the medical rationality model for living donors. In other words, this seems to be really relationship-driven at the kind of pair level basis. And I have a ton, if you want to know about it, I have a ton of qualitative data that says the same thing. So I believe in that one pretty strongly. I think that's really the takeaway here, is that living donor transplants, you might think of this as this kind of technical biomedical process, but in the end, it's about who we are to each other and what we owe to each other and who we've been for each other. And the close tie avoidance model for this one, I don't really get any support. So that's for living donor transplants. Let's go back to the bigger question of to whom do we turn in times of need? I think the answer is going to be, it really depends on what kind of needs that we have. You know, it's a really low bar to confide in somebody in those situations I talked about. If you're complaining about your partner at the bar, if you're complaining about your advisor in the lab. You know, you don't need a really strong connection. In fact, it might even be better if you don't, because the person you're complaining about, your close friends know them, because of network closure, right? So it's a lot more complicated to have these kind of confining things with ties that you're close to, because you might, because there's this layers of expectations, these deep embeddedness of your relationships that might really kind of complicate what otherwise you want to be a relatively simple transaction. I have this thing on my chest, I want to get it off, right? Which is what Mario Small is measuring when he's trying to argue contrary to conventional wisdom about close tie activation. So combining might be more amenable to close tie avoidance. But if you're really asking them for something besides 15 minutes of their time, I don't think that's who you turn to. You don't ask people at the bar for a living donor kidney transplant. Right? We laugh.
Especially not at the bar.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, probably better than at the chicken fried steak restaurant, but you know, yeah, not a great place either way. So when you're really asking them for something to say, I need your continued support. I keep hitting my microphone. Sorry to anyone watching this video. When you're asking them for money, you don't ask people for money at the bar either. For continued support, I have this medical issue and I need care every day. Or I get off work at 5 and my child gets out of school at 3. Can you be there for me? These are not things you ask strangers for. These are not functions for disposable ties. These are the people that we engage in these reciprocal and symmetrical relationships cyclically over the course of our lives. And I think our results show that living donor transplants is a very similar kind of thing, which might seem obvious, But everything is obvious once you know the answer, right? To quote the Duncan Watts book. So I really think Small couches his argument as a challenge to the general literature, but I think he pitches his argument too widely. I think we really need to focus on what kind of assistance we're looking for people for network tie activation, and that really drives what kind of divergent outcomes you might see. I have no dispute of his results with the confidence numbers. I covered that. So some major questions remain. As I mentioned, I think spouses and parents deserve special attention in the future. These are not symmetrical and reciprocal relations, so they might have very different dynamics than, say, siblings, friends, and so on. Generally, I have two other data sets I haven't told you about, where we've given living donation vignettes to 6,000 people on Amazon's Mechanical Turk, where we present them with a randomly generated vignette based on their own social network to say your sister Mary comes to you and says, I have kidney disease, I need a living donor under varying conditions with different pieces of information. What say you? And there's a numerical rating and then an open-ended text response data. I and 3 different RAs have coded every single one of those. Gives us a code book of 84 detailed and 17 broader reasons people will not, and are ambivalent about living donation, and they strongly correlate with these relationship categories. Okay. But when we were coding these, we did not have that in the relationship category information in front of us. We just said, what theme is this expressing? What considerations were they bringing to bear on this decision? And it's just really tightly is associated with relationship categories. So that's not quite ready for prime time. I can show you a couple slides on it if you want. But I really think that reinforces the main takeaway of what I showed you today. I really want to get into, as I was continuing with in response to Jenny earlier, how kind of American demographic change has really kind of driven this post-2004 decline in living donor transplants, especially that decline in genetically related donors. I think we have changes in intergenerational spacing, changes in fertility and mortality rates, and probably how all those things are correlated. That could really affect the size of your potential living donor pool in the genetically related category. At least it's something we need to rule out if we're going to instead say, oh, it's actually about some cultural change, about change in socioeconomic status or something. We need to at least measure how these ties have evolved, because it might have reached a tipping point where families were really different in people in the typical age ranges where they have kidney disease than they were before. Second, most of our study samples so far have been white and black, based on the populations we've been able to study and enact. And that's going to continue to be the case. I think the Latino and Latina, Asian Pacific Islander, and American Indian and Alaska Native populations are likely to have some very different results here for a variety of reasons. First, you might have different kind of systems of kinship obligations according to different sorts of cultures that could drive those results. Second, in the case of Latinx and API populations, you're going to have many more people who are first and second generation immigrants, and therefore many of their potential donor pool may not live in the U.S. with them. Right? So there could be just very different kind of social determinants and barriers to living donation to those populations that I hope to study in the future. Finally, within our samples, I think we really want to unpack, I think especially, both of these equally, the racial, ethnic, and gender differences. We have some sample size issues with doing too deep comparisons there, but I think that's definitely the next step we want to do, along with improving the donor availability simulation, doing the qualitative analysis I talked about before. We also have 27 semi-structured qualitative interviews we did back in 2014 that we've already coded, but I'd like to go back and recode with respect to the themes of this analysis. With that, I thank you for your time, and I look forward to all your questions and enjoy this question telling. Which, if any of you were wondering what to give me for Christmas, I don't actually have one. So, anyway, thank you so much. I swear I timed this at 40 minutes like you did.
Hi, thank you for the great presentation, and I really like your data and then your way to especially separate out the patient-initiated discussions and the auto-initiated discussions. I really like that, the distinctions. My question, I think, is that the tie activation in the previous nano literature actually is kind of the ego, or in your case, it's patient-initiated discussions. I need help. So I ask help to others. But in case of the donor-initiated discussion, it's not actually tie activations. I think it depends on, it went through different mechanisms. So for example, my friend, when I have some kidney issues, I talk my issues to my family members because it is not only my problem, it is also my family's problem if I have my kidneys fail. But in terms of the friends, whether I talk my issue to the friend or not is kind of my selections, right? But some friend actually know about my situation and he spread out the news to the other friend. Then some friend hear about my conditions and initiate, hey, I heard that you have bad kidney. I have a good kidney. Take me one. So that kind of the mechanism is actually not an activation part.
Yeah.
It is more, I don't know how to conceptualize that. So in your, so my kind of the empirical question is, I wonder the percentage of donor initiate across the relationship categories, right? So I guess some friend within a friend category.
Yeah, you know, I didn't give you a slide of that, did I? Sure. Well, do I have it in backups? Maybe. There's a bunch of. Yeah, I just have the proportionate green conditional on the other asking, which is much higher for volunteers. If someone offers their kidney to me, I almost never turn them down, except you'll notice children's relatively low on that scale. I think that's interesting, along with nieces and nephews, but there's only 7 there. Whereas if I ask people, they're much less likely to agree in the other direction. I don't have the, oh no, here we go. So this is, these are slides from a talk I gave analyzing the kind of racial divide in living donor transplants. So I don't have it for everyone. But you do have the average number of volunteers, and that's donor-initiated discussions, versus the average number of candidate-initiated discussions in the right-hand side. And you can see that they're relatively equal, but that you have a very large racial disparity on the volunteer side, where you don't have it on the asking side. Yeah. I think that's a statistic in need of confirmation and further interrogation, but I think but given the high agreement rates when people do volunteer, I think that's an important dynamic to explore in the future. But yeah, you can see that in terms of the overall balance, they're relatively equal, but one has a very large racial disparity and the other doesn't. By the way, that looks very similar to what you would see if you compare the proportion of transplant candidates who get deceased donor transplants versus living. The percentage for living is lower, more people get deceased donor transplants, but on the deceased donor side, we don't really have racial ethnic disparities anymore. It's really been driven over to the living donor side. So I think there's a kind of parallel here that I really want to unpack into too much. Yes?
As I look at this, I'm wondering how much that has to do with the amount of individuals in the Black community who have conditions that would disqualify them,
Absolutely.
or like have family members that have diabetes or kidney disease, and they're thinking, oh, I can't volunteer my kidney, I might need the second one when the other one fails.
Absolutely. So in my dissertation work, I'm sure you all read of Kin and Kidneys and 2014 Social Science and Medicine issue. I call that the, what was that hypothesis? The differential axis hypothesis, and it turns out not to be true. Because the individual members of the network of kidney transplant candidates in the African American community are individually less likely to be medically suitable donors. But in aggregate, they actually, due to the larger typical kinship network sizes, they actually have access to greater numbers of donors all around. So from the ego perspective, the question is just 0 or 1, did you get one, or how many? And it's the aggregate level calculations that matter more for that. Be sure to check that one out. The electronic supplementary material that nobody reads is actually where all the good stuff is. You write a dissertation and then they're like, can you cut it down to 3,000 words?
In the beginning, you mentioned that you thought it was feasible to move from, or just drastically increase the number of living donors. And I think you said it was 15% currently, and you see it at 50%. What kind of was leading you to say that, or how, in what way do you think it would be feasible?
So that's another thing I'm still sitting on. I haven't published. Here's the graph. So this is from a NACT. Again, sample of 73 people at a large southeastern transplant center. And again, this is something, I think I had probably one here. But this is, I had 2 different measures here. I categorize people as a possible donor and a likely donor. Now these are based on candidate reports, right? Totally unreliable, but they're they're likely not nonsense, right? So possible donor, I say that they're a possible donor if the candidate believes they're healthy enough to donate, and they haven't had a discussion, but the candidate thinks that they are very likely to donate if asked, but they haven't had that conversation yet. So that's, obviously there's layers of uncertainty with both of those bullet points, but it's a promising indicator. Likely donor, again, this still relies on the candidate reports of health. So how reliable those things are, we can debate. But these are people who have actually discussed donation with the person and they agreed to be evaluated. So the candidate thinks that it's likely that they're healthy enough and they've already had the discussion. So if you combine these two and you say, who has access to at least one promising or likely donor? If you look at the left-hand axis, we get, I think, 88%. So I'm sure many of those are false positives, right? Like lots of people that I believe in my family and social network are healthy enough to donate aren't. Turns out they have stage 2 CKD themselves. They have chronic kidney disease. They have a little bit of hypertension, and they're relatively young, so the doctors are concerned that donation would accelerate that kind of deteriorating health effect. But maybe not 50%, but basically, for it not to at least be feasible to go higher, you'd have to think that these measures are utter nonsense, which, is something I'm going to test. In the eventual data we're going to collect, we're going to, the surveys we did for FORCE and for ENACT, we're going to marry them. We're going to get the ego networks, then we're going to get contact information on the member of those networks, and then field them mail and web surveys, and basically give them the FORCE survey. And so then we'll be able to much more precisely calculate how reliable these candidate reports are. So stay tuned, but again, this number is so high, it would just have to be completely off base to think that we couldn't. If there weren't these kind of social relationship effects intervening between being able to donate and actually donating, that's not part of what's driving what's happening. And leading to what I call underutilization of living other
So if that's true, why is it so low right now?
Okay, so when we do that full kind of varied study, I'll have a lot better answers. But I can say a couple things. One is that I think it's hard to talk about these things without kind of sounding callous, but there are certain fields that we're farming much more thoroughly than others, is what I would say here. So these close nuclear family ties, maybe there's some room to grow there, but it seems like people are already really leaning on those ties. I would say the kind of fertile and untilled ground is in these extended network ties, right? That's where a lot of this calculation is coming from. You have a lot of cousins, you have a lot of nieces and nephews, you have a lot of aunts and uncles, you have a lot of maybe second order friends. So I'm just saying, when I talk about medically and demographically feasible, I mean that they're in your first or second order tie network, and that they seem like promising potential donors that should probably be evaluated if you want to maximize the chance that you get a living donor transplant. So I think a lot of it has to do with our cultural sense of who is an appropriate living donor and who isn't. But by the way, if I didn't show you the, yes. There's a one on this one. If you look at kind of reported willingness, these green dots are ENACT and the orange squares are FORCE. And you can see that generally, if you ask both candidates and alters to rate their willingness to donate, transplant candidates severely underestimate for almost every relationship category how willing people say they are to donate to their potential recipient. So insofar as a lot of people aren't asking everyone they know to consider it, I think that probably all relationship categories are underutilized. You can see it's relatively close for spouses here. That's a smaller gap. But you have a really big gap for nieces and nephews, for aunts and uncles, all the way up to their cousins, right? I think there's a lot of healthy, willing donors that we're just never having these conversations with. I think it's a big part of the story.
Do you have thoughts on using maybe the bone marrow transplant as a comparison for this? Because I think they have a less successful match rate for family, but it's also less burden on the donor. It's still painful and very inconvenient, but they're not losing an organ.
Okay. Yeah, since you knew about the size thing, my understanding with bone marrow transplants is you need an exact tissue type match. Is that right?
Yeah, so they have a registry where strangers are donating, and there's a lot of racial disparities there, especially with who's joining the registry, but also like with sickle cell disease.
Yeah.
You have that effect more on some patients more.
Okay, so you're saying compared to, how would the comparison to the registry help us understand this, or
No,
how
I'm
would the
just
living?
thinking sociologically, if you're asking the bone marrow.
Because I guess it
donors.
regenerates.
Well, yeah, but just also like what their experiences and who they're talking to and who they're donating from. Just
Yeah, my suspicion would be it would be a lot more driven by the genetic side and less by the relationship category side. But as far as the discussions go,
I think it's like only 30% of people are matching with their family.
Okay.
Like a lot of people have to rely on strangers.
Okay. I don't have any developed thoughts on that. That is because of the much stronger kind of tissue type requirement involved in bone marrow donation, and because I think of kind of progressively greater awareness of this issue. That is a subject I've thought about branching into, but I don't have enough background on that to feel like I can really speculate on that. Thank you for that question. Yes.
Thinking about the quote that you put up earlier about the impact of transplanting on a relationship and having a creditor-debtor dynamic, did you look at all as to how common that is in different types of relationships, that actually bears out that the relationship suffers after donation?
So I don't have data on that right now. We're gonna do follow-ups for the kind of matched survey thing, but that's gonna be mostly through medical records. I think it's gonna be really tough to recontact all of these people. That said, that's a great question. I'm not sure how much of resources make sense to follow up into that, because there's so little support for the tyranny of the gift hypothesis now. At least it doesn't seem to be driving people to avoid having living donor discussions at all. Whether they sour on a large scale down the road, I mean, certainly yes. In Fox and Swayze's work, there's some qualitative evidence for that. So yeah, so maybe they're surprised by it, right? Maybe they don't think in advance it's going to work that way, but it does actually work out that way, where people feel like they can never live up to the size of the gift that's been given. So yeah, no, that'd be a really cool
It seems like
study.
it might impact this sort of willingness estimate if people feel like they would feel so indebted to this person that they probably wouldn't be willing anyway. You know, you kind of get into that cycle. I wonder if it might drive some of the perception.
Totally. So I don't. Yeah. So I think that's where the semi-structured candidate interviews I alluded to earlier would really come in handy. It's been a few years since I was conducting these with a research assistant, but I think a lot of people did say things like they just seem to express a lot of fear of rejection, right? It's bad enough that you're sick and on dialysis. It's another if you directly initiated a discussion with someone and then they shoot you down, someone that you thought you could count on. So yeah, I think that could very much happen into that. So like I said, I want to reanalyze this data with respect to these themes. I don't have a pattern answer for you, but yeah, I think that's where I want to look. And so if that's for the shadow of the tyranny of the gift, you know, like prospectively looking forward and anticipating that relationship. But yeah, I think a follow-up study would be incredible. I'm not aware of anything like that.
Thanks for this talk. My question actually goes back to maybe the earlier reason why you're doing this in the 2006 or 4 mark where it started, you saw these donations going down. I was wondering in the survey if you asked questions to people about their perception of the deceased donor market, or of I guess how efficient that the medical system is in providing donors when necessary, because I wonder if some of people's reluctance or like their idea around kidney donating is sort of stems on assuming that the medical system can offer a solution that they don't have to think about.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in the interviews I've conducted, people are very aware of the waiting list and its increasing length. And you know, this is actually one waiting list. There's 58. You can sign up for multiple ones. It varies a lot. By the way, if you need a kidney in California, good luck. You might want to pull a Steve Jobs and buy a Gulfstream and fly to Memphis, Tennessee to get your liver transplant. Anyway, I think people are pretty aware of that. Like by the time they're transplant candidates, they've been thoroughly coached that basically, if you want to transplant in the next 6 months, you need to go in and do it in the vast majority of cases. For a kidney, it might be more feasible for something that's more immediately life-threatening, like the liver or heart. But as far as the potential donor side of things, I think is where you're going with that. I think, so we have a qualitative code for that. I didn't show you that code book. We have, in the detailed coding system, we have one, like, if it's like the last option kind of code. Like, I don't want to do it, but, you know, I don't want them to die, and if I'm the way that they prevent that, then maybe I do it. Of course, you don't know when someone's about to die, right? And you're on the waiting list for years. So I don't know how useful people that express that kind of thought will be in terms of generating living donor transplants. So I think that's a thought. I don't think it was a super common one in the data that we had. Now, but that data was from random on NTURC, not people actually in this situation. So I don't know how much that will generalize. It's more kind of taking the temperature of the general culture and the cultural construction of when and why it's appropriate to be a living donor, rather than people in that specific situation. Which is all a long way of saying I have some relevant information but can't really directly answer your question, but I'd love to know the answer as well. that's the thing with this, because we don't really have this outside the hospital data, like these little pieces that we've managed to collect, it just raises so many more questions, which you should, of course, if you happen to meet an IDDK program officer, you should tell them about all the clinical studies we can do as follow-ups. And, but yeah, so like we're just scratching the surface. We have our research questions, but yes, I definitely want to delve into all manner of things on the kind of two-sided search process outside of clinical. Yes.
I'm curious about how marital status can change the likelihood of asking and having people volunteer.
Yeah.
Because on one hand, being married is not only you have this person who's more likely to donate, and also you get access to this whole new group of people who are your in-laws. But then on the other hand, it could be that, oh, this person's married, their spouse can donate, I'm not going to even think about donating mine because they have their person.
Yeah, so qualitatively, I have that code. It's, leave it to closer family or whatever, they're outside my sphere of caring. They have their own family kind of codes, this kind of thing. So that's a non-trivial but not super common response. I think mostly probably due to social desirability bias on that front. But I can tell you that from the potential donor side, you might think those obligations extend within. People say, oh, my primary concern is for my spouse and my children. So I can't be worried about my siblings right now. They have their own family. They should take care of each other as well. I can tell you that in terms of relative utilization, for the proportion in each relationship category that are married doesn't seem to be a major determinant. I don't think I threw that into regression models. I should look at that. And similar for parent, actually, relationship categories are parents, obviously, including parents themselves. Actually, if you take parents out, I don't know that there's a really strong relationship here. I should we do it that way. Like, if I were drawing a line, ignoring that one, I think it would look about like that, right? So, so I don't see a really strong effect of these kind of family formation effects, which is one thing that Fox and Swayze speculated about. They have a whole section of kind of discussion of the American kinship system and how it might impact this. And they talk a lot about how these kind of transitions to adulthood transitions of forming an enduring relationship, having children, that kind of thing, shifts your familial priorities in ways that could affect living donation. At least in the data I have, I don't have a super strong evidence of that. But yeah, on the candidate side, I haven't thought to include that yet. We did, just like race, ethnicity, age, gender controls, really. So I'll be sure to look at that. Yes.
I'm wondering, in the close genetic ties or marital status, how much the additional burden of caregiving or disease if you have now 2 patients, right, versus just the one. So if I'm your family member, right, and so now I'm going to have to go to multiple medical appointments in addition to the lots of dialysis appointments that the other person, and you normally rely on each other for care. I'm just wondering how that plays into utilizing your immediate genetic ties, and maybe why you might want to look to a friend who's not within this network, right?
That's a really awesome point. And I have not thought of it. So let me turn around in real time. They have double surgery in one house, you've got kids running around or something too?
Exactly, right. So now you've got 2 people in bed that need to recover and then need to figure out how to make that happen.
Yes. I have some good news on that front. I suspect that's very much consideration, especially for those without nearby family or close friends they can rely on. So I bet that's a consideration in at least some cases. I don't know how general, because a lot of people for that kind of situation, probably their parents would come down or do something if they had to. That said, I do have some good news, which is to say, and this is not usually a sentence I'm about to say, but Trump issued a really good executive order. It's true, it came out over the summer. It's called something about advancing American kidney health. And one of the provisions is to make the act of living kidney donation entirely financially neutral. And they take a very expensive view of this. So the exact regulations aren't out yet. But one of the things that they're aiming to do is cover all the indirect costs of surgery. You might have to travel a long distance to perform the surgery for all your kind of run-up tests. And they're also going to cover child elder care and other dependent care during your recovery period. So I bet that is about to become less of a consideration if those regulations are enacted in any kind of reasonable way. But yeah, certainly looking backwards into the past, I bet that's a really important consideration that I completely missed. Thank you.
I was also wondering, you showed a slide at the difference kind of over time of who's donating. And I was wondering what your thoughts about why those are changing, especially if they are close ties. Do you think it's a kind of difference in time over who is considered close? Or?
I so wish I had a time machine, because the data that I would need to answer that question didn't exist and it's too late. We could do some retrospective stuff maybe. So I thought about this a lot. One idea I had, go back to this graph, so many animations, here we go. One idea I had is that you could very broadly coarsen it into a few different things. One is the kind of kinship and family and friendship structures I talked about before, that I'd like to kind of look at how intergenerational spacing and its correlation with fertility and mortality and morbidity patterns has fed into this population over time. Another thing you could do is you could do retrospective chart reviews where you look at patterns of relationships in people who were evaluated regardless of whether they actually donated. Does it match the same pattern? Because that's a very different mechanism if it's about who's coming forward to be evaluated versus who's medically approved. So if the same relationship patterns are coming in to be evaluated, but then you're getting this very starkly changing relationship distribution, that would suggest that it's about health, compatibility, and other issues like that. Right. That people are being screened out as donors for primarily medical, psychological, or other reasons. On the other hand, if the people being evaluated as donors are shifting systematically, then that suggests a very different kind of social search mechanism. I have no idea which it is because although we have amazing aggregate data for completed transplants, we don't have that kind of systematic data on evaluations. So maybe each individual hospital does, maybe we can do something together, those data together and code it, but to my knowledge, nothing like that exists at present. Yes?
So as a potential solution, or do you have suggestions, like patient education or coaching or something to
Yes.
reduce their inhibitions?
I spent the last 2 years developing 2 interventions that I have not said a word about. So these are candidate side interventions that we're developing. Just because we didn't have the fodder, the data fodder we needed for the alter side interventions that I'd really like to develop. So the candidate side interventions are twofold. One, we took that panel of 6,000 qualitative responses I told you about before, took the code books, and then developed scripts or bullet point talking points that candidates can kind of rely on as a crutch when initiating limited discussions in a way that matches the most common kind of favorable 4 elements of reasoning that people give when they're asked to consider this, and maybe addresses the most common kind of concerns about donation, things like health, recovery time, and so on. So we have that. If you've gone to my PA talk this year, you've heard all about it. We also have another one where we basically do some population health coaching, basically as a personalized simulation, and say, if you tell me about your family and social network and some basic things about them, I can cross-reference that within Haynes and give you a predicted probability that they're medically suitable donors, and kind of rank them into tiers. Basically, your 80-year-old grandma, no chance, right? Your 20-year-old nephew, much better chance, So doing these just very simple calculations. Originally, I wanted to bring in the blood and tissue type matching process too, and then nephrologist after nephrologist kept saying, like, listen, it's 2019, pair donation is such a common thing today that if I have a healthy, willing donor, I can make it happen. So the blood and tissue type matching thing is another point, which as a trained biodemographer, I was very sad about because I really wanted the genetic prediction model to be a part of that, but I let it go because it's not about me. We just have a very simple kind of demographic model that sorts people in your network according to the predicted probability that they'd be free of these absolute and relative contraindications for donation. So that's what we're doing now. But with that paired survey I told you about that we're going to field hopefully starting next year, what I really want to do is gather data on all the kind of barriers to donation that could potentially keep people who are healthy and willing to donate from doing so, right? So we ask questions like, how, if you need to take a month off of work without paid family leave, this question might be out of date now with that executive order we talked about. Because they're also going to match lost wages, by the way. Like it's a wild change. We were going to ask, could you afford to take a month off of work? How concerned would you be about the following costs: housing, childcare, transportation, all these kinds of things. And so we're going to try to measure the kind of socioeconomic and practical barriers in terms of family situation to donation, and then propose interventions along those lines. And I'm pretty sure Trump beat those to probably all the things we're going to do. It's probably the upset of the year in terms of like what you predict would happen. Here we are. Apparently Melania had some kidney issues previously in her life. I think that might be part of what's happening here. So we were hoping that by collecting these alter side data, we could better understand the barriers to donation in a more systematic way than we previously had access to, and then use that as fodder to propose alter side donation interventions in the future. So that was the plan. I guess we're going to have to revisit some of that. Michael, did you have a question here? Okay. All right, well, I think it's time for lunch, so thank you so much for coming to what we were talking about, kidney transplant at the Pop Center.